A little girl on a plane turned to a billionaire and whispered, "Sir, could you pretend to be my dad?" What happened next changed all their lives forever. The private jet hummed softly as it soared above the clouds, slicing through the golden hues of a late afternoon sky. Everything inside the aircraft gleamed with quiet luxury. Polished mahogany panels, soft leather seats, and faint classical music playing in the background. Callan Tarot, the reclusive billionaire CEO of Tarotech, sat in solitude in the front cabin, a glass of untouched mineral water on the tray beside him, and a sleek tablet displaying quarterly projections on his lap. He wasn't looking at it. His cold blue eyes were fixed on the window, watching the clouds pass like dreams he had long given up on. He was a man of exact routines, a lover of silence, and the last person to ever engage in idle conversation, especially not with strangers. Yet, on this flight from New York to Atlanta, something entirely unexpected was about to pierce that carefully maintained isolation. A soft tug at his sleeve. Callan turned his head, mildly irritated, expecting perhaps an inattentive flight attendant. But instead, he saw her, a little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, with tightly braided hair, oversized glasses that slightly slipped down her nose, and a threadbare pink cardigan buttoned all the way to her neck. Her large brown eyes stared up at him, filled with something he couldn't quite name: urgency, fear, and a strange kind of bravery. "Excuse me, sir," she said in a voice so small and polite, it almost disappeared in the engine's hum. "Could you maybe pretend to be my dad, just for a little bit?" The question struck him harder than any corporate betrayal ever had. He blinked. "I'm sorry. What did you just say?" She swallowed, her hands nervously wringing the hem of her cardigan. "I need someone to be my dad. Not really, just pretend. Only for a little while." Callan stared at her, bewildered. "Why?" She hesitated, biting her lip, then looked down the aisle toward the back of the plane. Following her gaze, Callan noticed a woman slumped over in one of the rear seats, pale, thin, her hand clutching her side, knuckles white from pressure. The woman looked like she was in pain, but trying very hard not to show it. "She's my mom," the little girl continued, her voice trembling now. "She's really sick. We weren't supposed to be on this flight. She used fake tickets. She was just trying to get to a hospital in Atlanta that might help her. We didn't know what else to do." Her voice cracked and she blinked away tears, trying desperately not to cry in front of a stranger. "They're going to check the tickets again soon, I think. And if they find out—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. "Please, sir, if they think you're my dad, they won't ask questions." Callan's first instinct was to say no. This wasn't his problem. He didn't do drama, didn't do lies, didn't do children, especially not desperate ones on the edge of catastrophe. He should have called for security, or pressed the button for the flight attendant. He had enough power to get them both removed with a word. But something in her eyes froze him. Not fear, not pleading. Hope. Raw, reckless hope. He looked again at the woman in the back, now visibly struggling to breathe, her shoulders slumped as if crushed by invisible weight. He couldn't explain what came over him, only that for the first time in years, his heart did something unusual. It ached. He leaned back slowly and gestured to the seat beside him. "What's your name?" he asked. "I'm Marlowe," she said, voice still trembling. "Well, Marlowe," he replied quietly, "come sit here. Let's make sure nobody bothers us, all right?" Her face lit up like sunrise, breaking through a storm. She climbed into the seat nervously, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit to her chest. And for the first time since Calantero had boarded the flight, he closed his tablet, turned off his phone, and gave another human being his full attention. Something inside him shifted that day. But neither he nor Marlowe could have imagined just how deeply that one whispered request would rewrite the rest of their lives. The hum of the engines grew quieter in Callan's ears as he sat beside Marlowe, the little girl who had just shattered the sterile calm of his world with a single, impossible request. For a while, they simply sat in silence. She didn't fidget like most children might. She held her stuffed rabbit tightly and stared down the aisle, her small chest rising and falling in quiet anticipation. Callan didn't know what he was doing. He wasn't the kind of man who acted without calculation. Every business acquisition, every speech, every move in the public eye had been measured, weighed, and executed with precision. And yet now he was improvising his way into what might be considered fraud on a commercial airline. For a stranger, a child. She looked up at him again, cautiously. "They always check after takeoff," she whispered. "Sometimes they don't. But if they see she's alone with me and I'm not listed as a minor flying with a parent, they might. Her voice faltered. She didn't finish. Callan glanced toward the rear again. The woman, Marlowe's mother, was struggling to sit upright. Her skin was pale, almost translucent. Her lips tinged a troubling shade of blue. Her hand trembled as she adjusted her seatbelt. Her eyes were open but unfocused, as if holding onto consciousness itself was a battle. Callan didn't hesitate. He rose from his seat with quiet authority and walked slowly toward her, heads turned, especially the flight attendants stationed mid-cabin. The moment the woman saw him approaching, her weak eyes widened in confusion and alarm. She tried to speak, but only managed a hoarse gasp. Her chest heaved. "Miss," the flight attendant began, stepping forward, sensing something was wrong. "Is everything—" Callan cut her off, his voice cool and firm, carrying the exact tone he used in boardrooms to shut down unnecessary commentary. "This is my wife. She's not well. We had to board last minute and didn't get to update our booking properly. Please move her to the front of the cabin with me. Now!" The attendant blinked, recognizing his face, perhaps even his name. Billionaire, influential, untouchable. "Oh, of course, Mr. Tarot. I wasn't aware. I'm so sorry." Callan bent and gently took the woman by the arm. She tried to pull away, confusion and embarrassment flashing across her face. "I don't know who you—" He leaned in close, so only she could hear. "Your daughter asked me to help. Let me help." She froze. Marlowe had now followed, watching with wide eyes as her mother was lifted gently and slowly escorted toward the front. When they reached his private suite, Callan helped her into one of the reclined leather seats. The woman's breath was shallow, but she gave him a tiny, bewildered nod of thanks, as if clinging to the last remnants of dignity she possessed. "What's your name?" he asked her softly. "Rowena," she whispered. "Rowena Hale." Callan glanced at Marlowe, then back at Rowena. "You should have told me you were this sick before we boarded," he said out loud, enough for the hovering attendant to hear. "We're lucky the pilot didn't cancel the flight." Rowena blinked, catching on. She gave a weak smile, one mixed with shock, gratitude, and a visible struggle to process what was happening. "Yes," she said after a moment, playing along. "Yes, I should have." The attendant smiled politely. "Let me know if she needs anything. I'll bring warm compresses and water." She disappeared into the galley. Callan sat back down in his original seat. Marlowe immediately climbed up beside him, settling next to her mother. The cabin felt different now. No longer a sanctuary of isolation, but a fragile cocoon holding together the lives of three people who, just hours before, had been complete strangers. He watched Marlowe quietly adjust her mother's blanket and gently tuck her stuffed rabbit between them. "She used to be stronger," she said softly. "She worked 2 jobs, cleaning offices and folding clothes at night. But then she started coughing and falling asleep on her feet. I knew something was wrong." Callan didn't respond right away. He was still processing the absurdity and gravity of what he had just done. But there was no turning back now. Not when a child had chosen him of all people, to be the wall between her and the world. After a long pause, he looked down at Marlowe and asked, "Why me?" She didn't blink. "You looked like you wouldn't be afraid." It was such a simple answer, and it made him feel something he hadn't felt in a long time. Human. As the flight continued and dusk turned the clouds pink and purple beyond the window, Callan Tarot, titan of industry and master of control, sat with a frail woman leaning against him, a brave child by his side, and an unexpected sense of responsibility blooming in his chest. For the first time in years, he wasn't traveling alone, and maybe, just maybe, that mattered more than any deal waiting for him in Atlanta. The sun had set by the time the wheels of the jet touched down on the tarmac in Atlanta, casting a deep amber glow across the skyline. The descent was smooth, but the atmosphere inside the aircraft was anything but calm. Callan sat upright, his muscles tense beneath his tailored suit. The events of the flight kept echoing through his mind. The girl's trembling voice, her mother's ashen face, the way he'd claimed them without hesitation, as though they belonged to him. The moment the plane taxied to a stop, a sleek black car waited at the base of the stairs, its tinted windows and polished surface reflecting the tarmac lights like glass. One of Callan's personal drivers, a burly man in a dark suit named Terrell, opened the rear door without a word. Callan stood first, then extended a hand to Rowena, who moved slowly, one hand pressed to her side. Her skin was still pale, and her lips were slightly cracked, but she nodded silently as if trying to hold on to composure. Marlowe followed behind them, her small hand tightly clutching her mother's coat. The three of them stepped into the back seat, and as the car pulled away from the runway, silence fell. The only sound was the distant murmur of the city, filtered through the double-paned windows. Callan cleared his throat, his voice low. "You need a hospital, tonight." Rowena shook her head immediately. "No, not yet. If they ask for insurance or payment, we'll be thrown out." "I'll take care of it," he said bluntly. Rowena gave him a pained look. "Why are you doing this?" He looked away for a moment, as if the answer was hidden somewhere in the passing streetlights. Then, without turning back, he said, "Because your daughter trusted me when she had no one else to turn to. And that means something." Rowena stared at him, her lips parting slightly. For a long time, she said nothing. Her gaze softened, but her body remained stiff, uncertain. The car curved up a long private drive toward an imposing iron gate, which parted automatically to reveal a sprawling estate hidden by tall oaks and trimmed hedges. The mansion was more fortress than home, modern, cold, efficient, not a place designed for warmth or laughter. As the car rolled to a halt, the grand double doors opened, and a tall, severe-looking woman in a gray pencil skirt and high heels stepped out to greet them. Her hair was pulled back into a tight chignon, and a digital tablet was clutched in her hand. "Mr. Tarot," she said without smiling, "you're late. The conference call with Geneva—" "Cancel it," he said sharply, "and bring a nurse. Immediately." Her eyes flicked toward Rowena and Marlowe, narrowing ever so slightly. "Sir, may I ask who—" "They're guests, for now," Callan interrupted, "and they'll stay in the East Wing." The woman, Ms. Kinsley, hesitated for only a moment before nodding curtly. "Very well. I'll make arrangements." Inside, the house was vast, sleek, and spotless. Every surface gleamed, every step echoed. Marlowe clung to her mother, her eyes wide as she took in the high ceilings, the massive glass panels, and the cold gray stone floors. There were no family photos, no signs of life beyond function and wealth. This was not a home, it was a machine. They were shown to a guest suite, two interconnected rooms with minimalist furniture, a private bathroom, and windows that overlooked a lit-up garden outside. A private nurse arrived shortly after, quietly and professionally checking Rowena's vitals. "She needs full testing and imaging," the nurse said after a few minutes. "Tonight, I'll arrange a transport to St. Alora's. They can discreetly handle VIP patients." Callan nodded. "Do it." After the nurse left, Rowena sat on the edge of the bed, breathing heavily. Marlowe sat beside her, holding her hand. "I don't know how to thank you," Rowena murmured, her voice trembling. "I don't know what this is, or what you want in return, but—" "I want nothing," Callan said, sitting across from her. "Just let me help, that's all." Rowena looked at him with confusion. Her entire life had taught her that help always came with a price. Yet this man, this stranger, seemed to mean it. That night, as the nurse escorted Rowena to the hospital, Marlowe remained behind. Callan had given her a room down the hall from his own and told her she could call him if she needed anything. Around midnight, he passed by her room. The door was slightly ajar, and he saw her curled up on the enormous bed, the rabbit tucked under her arm, her eyes open and fixed on the ceiling. He stepped in quietly. "Can't sleep?" She looked at him and whispered, "I'm afraid. What if she doesn't come back?" Callan hesitated. The truth hovered on his lips. But instead, he walked to the bed and sat beside her. "Your mom's a fighter," he said gently. "She's stronger than you know." Marlowe turned her head to him. "You're different than I thought." "How so?" "You looked like you didn't care about anything," she said, honestly and without fear. "But I think you do. You just forgot how." Her words struck something in him, soft, buried, and painful. He didn't reply. Instead, he tucked the blanket around her shoulders and stood up to leave. But just before he reached the door, she whispered again, "Good night, Dad." The word hung in the air like a warm breath in winter. He paused, and then, without looking back, replied quietly, "Good night, Marlowe." And for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone in the world. Morning light spilled through the tall glass windows of the East Wing, casting a soft golden sheen across the cool marble floors. The sun had barely risen over the Atlanta skyline, but Callan Tarot was already awake, standing in the kitchen dressed in his usual crisp navy slacks and a plain white shirt, sleeves rolled up to his elbows. It was the first time in years he had made coffee with his own hands. He hadn't slept well. Marlowe's voice from the night before still echoed in his head. The small, fragile whisper of, "Good night, Dad." 3 words that had stirred something inside him, something long buried and dangerously alive. He had never been a father. He had once come close, years ago, but the pain that followed the loss of that dream had turned him to stone, or so he thought. As he stared into the steaming mug, lost in thought, he heard the soft pitter-patter of feet behind him. Marlowe entered the kitchen in a mismatched pair of fuzzy socks and a giant Terrotech hoodie that nearly swallowed her. Her braids were messy, and sleep still clung to her face, but she smiled when she saw him. "You're up early," he said, his voice low and quiet. She climbed onto one of the high stools at the counter and nodded. Couldn't sleep. Callan placed a glass of warm milk in front of her. She looked surprised, but then grinned. "Thanks." For a moment, they just sat together in silence, like they'd done this every morning for years. Like it was normal. A few minutes later, Ms. Kinsley entered with a tablet in hand, looking crisp and businesslike as always. She froze briefly at the sight of Marlowe in the kitchen, then resumed her usual efficiency. "Mr. Tarot, a quick update," she said, glancing uncomfortably at the child. "Ms. Hale was admitted to St. Alora's overnight. Preliminary results indicate a large thoracic mass, likely a tumor pressing against the lungs and heart. Biopsy is scheduled this morning." Marlowe's glass paused halfway to her lips. Her face went pale. Callan looked at her, then back at Kinsley. "That's enough," he said curtly. "Send all medical reports to me directly." Kinsley blinked, nodded, and left. Marlowe spoke first. "She's really sick, isn't she?" Callan sat down beside her. He didn't lie. "Yes, but she's in the best hospital in the state now, with the best doctors. I'm going to make sure she gets everything she needs." Marlowe stared at the countertop. Her little hands clenched. "People say that, but then they leave. Or they give up. I won't." She looked at him then, searching his face for something. Maybe doubt, maybe cracks. But he was steady, calm, unwavering. Her lower lip trembled for just a second before she looked down again. After breakfast, Callan surprised himself by canceling his entire day. No board meetings, no calls, no press. He assigned everything to his executive VP and told Kinsley to make no exceptions. He spent the day with Marlowe. They toured the gardens where she picked a single white daisy and tucked it behind her ear. They walked past the koi pond, where she knelt to stare at the colorful fish, and Callan found himself sitting cross-legged beside her, shoes and all, ignoring the dull ache in his knees. She showed him how to draw a bunny using only circles and lines on a napkin. She even convinced him to help her bake cookies with the estate's personal chef, who had never once shared his kitchen with anyone. They burned the first batch, but she laughed so hard that she cried. And Callan laughed too. Not the polite chuckle he reserved for investors, but a real laugh, unguarded and free. Later that evening, when the sun dipped low and the sky turned lavender, the hospital called. Rowena was stable. The tumor was malignant but operable. They had caught it just in time. The operation was scheduled for Friday. Recovery would be long but possible, if she had the right support. Callan thanked the surgeon personally and gave instructions for a private suite, full-time care, and complete discretion. After the call, he found Marlowe curled up in the sitting room with a book too large for her lap. She looked up, immediately reading his expression. "She's okay," he said softly. Tears flooded her eyes in an instant, and she bolted into his arms without hesitation. She clung to him, her small body shaking with sobs, not of grief but of overwhelming relief. He held her, not stiffly, not like a man unsure of what to do. He held her like a father would, as if she were already his. When she finally pulled away, she wiped her eyes on her sleeve and asked, "Can we visit her tomorrow?" "We'll be there first thing." "Can we bring cookies?" "The good ones," he smiled. "Absolutely. Maybe even a dozen." She gave a tired giggle and yawned. That night, she fell asleep in the guest lounge, wrapped in a blanket, with Callan seated nearby, typing a brief email on his laptop with one hand, the other resting protectively on the armrest beside her. The staff didn't recognize the man they saw that evening. Not the cold, mechanical mogul who once ordered a table thrown out because it squeaked, but a man who sat in silence next to a sleeping child, keeping her safe. For Callan Tarot, the fortress he had built around himself was beginning to crack, and for the first time in a long, long time, he was glad. The morning air was cool and fresh as Callan's sleek black sedan pulled up to the front entrance of St. Elora's Medical Center. The hospital was nestled behind layers of glass and manicured hedges, the kind of place reserved for the powerful and the elite. But as Callan stepped out of the car, dressed in a dark blazer and an expression carved from stone, he wasn't thinking about wealth or appearances. He was thinking about the fragile woman waiting for him 3 floors above, and the little girl clutching his hand tightly. Marlowe wore a sky blue dress and held a small box of cookies in her other hand. Her idea, of course. She had insisted they bake the soft kind for her mother, and after a dozen failed attempts and flour dusting Callan's shoulders like snow, they had succeeded. She had tied the box shut with a red ribbon from Kinsley's forgotten gift drawer. It was lopsided and imperfect, but full of heart. As they entered the hospital, nurses and doctors recognized Callan immediately. Some straightened their postures. Others whispered. The billionaire CEO was well known for his donations, his influence, and his icy demeanor. Yet today, walking hand in hand with a child, he seemed different. In the elevator, Marlowe stared up at him. "You're not afraid of hospitals?" she asked suddenly. Callan hesitated. "I wasn't. Not until I had a reason to be." "What reason?" He didn't answer. Instead, he looked straight ahead as the elevator doors opened to the 3rd floor. Rowena's private suite overlooked a quiet garden courtyard. She was sitting up in bed when they entered, dressed in a pale hospital gown, her hair combed back, her cheeks still a bit pale, but with more color than before. Her eyes lit up when she saw Marlowe. "My baby," she whispered. Marlowe rushed to the bed, placing the box of cookies gently on the table and hugging her mother with careful tenderness. Callan stood back, watching silently. It felt strangely intimate, like watching a painting come to life. Rowena looked past her daughter, her gaze falling on Callan. There was gratitude there and confusion, and something more complicated. "I didn't think you'd come," she said softly. "I told Marlowe we would," he replied simply. She smiled faintly. "I still can't figure you out." "You're not the only one." Marlowe jumped onto the chair beside the bed, opening the box. "We made snickerdoodles." "He helped, Mom." "He's actually not bad." Rowena's eyes widened a little. "He did he?" Callan gave a small shrug. She was very persuasive. They talked for a while about the garden outside, the koi fish back at the house, and the funny moment when Marlowe accidentally spilled flour on his head. Rowena listened, smiling more with each passing minute. It was the first time in a long while she didn't look like she was fighting to stay alive. Then came the silence, the kind that follows warmth but carries a weight of reality. Callan stood and walked to the window, staring out. "You didn't recognize me, did you?" Rowena looked at him, startled. "Should I have?" He turned slowly. 23 years ago, Brooklyn, the 4th Street Library. Rowena's lips parted. Her eyes searched his face. "No, you're not Caleb?" "Callan, now." "But yes." She covered her mouth. "I thought you left the city. I thought you forgot me. I thought you chose someone else," he said evenly. "When I came back, you were gone. I searched for months." Tears filled her eyes, but she shook her head. "No, I didn't choose anyone. I was pregnant. I got scared. My aunt forced me to move to Georgia. I sent letters to the address you gave me. They came back." Callan's breath caught. "You never knew?" "I thought you abandoned me." Rowena's voice broke. "I didn't. I swear. I never wanted to leave you." Marlowe sat frozen, eyes darting between them. "I'm your kid?" she asked in a whisper. "You're my dad?" Callan stepped forward. His chest rose and fell as if he were trying to hold something back. "I didn't know," he said, kneeling to Marlowe's level. "But yes, you are." She stared at him, wide-eyed. Then her arms wrapped around him in a trembling hug. A quiet, shaky sound escaped her. Part sob, part laughter, part disbelief. Rowena watched them, her hand pressed to her heart. The nurse entered moments later with a clipboard. "Ms. Hale, it's time for pre-op prep." Rowena nodded weakly. Callan stood and looked at her. "I'll be here, the entire time. You're not going through this alone." She nodded slowly, tears shining in her eyes. "Neither are you." They left the room so she could be prepped, and Callan sat with Marlowe in the waiting area. The two of them side by side, not strangers, not anymore. As the surgical doors closed behind Rowena, Callan took Marlowe's hand in his. And for once in his carefully ordered life, he didn't think about meetings or markets or margins. He thought only of her, of them, and how, despite all logic, fate had just rewritten everything he thought he'd lost. The hours in the surgical waiting room moved like molasses, slow, heavy, and impossible to ignore. Despite the sterile lighting and the muted walls lined with modern art, the air felt suffocating. Callan sat in a deep leather chair near the tall windows, but even the panoramic view of Atlanta's skyline offered no distraction. His fingers drummed rhythmically against the armrest, while Marlowe curled beside him under a light hospital blanket, her head resting on his arm, her face tilted toward the double doors, beyond which her mother was fighting for her life. Neither of them spoke much. Words felt too fragile, too shallow to contain the weight of what was happening. At one point, a nurse approached with an update. The surgery was progressing. Rowena was stable. The tumor was proving complicated, but the doctors were optimistic. Optimistic. A word Callan had always distrusted. He glanced down at Marlowe, who had dozed off. Her small hands still wrapped tightly around two of his fingers. She hadn't let go since the moment her mother was wheeled away. Callan had never felt this kind of helplessness before. Not in business, not in life. Every challenge he'd faced could be dismantled with strategy, leverage, or money. But now, all he could do was wait and hope. He thought about Rowena, about the girl he had once loved in a musty Brooklyn library, about the afternoons they'd spent reading poetry out loud between bookshelves, about the letter she had left behind, which never reached him, and about the family they should have had, lost in a misstep of fate and misunderstanding. He could still remember the way she used to laugh, freely, without shame. That laughter had once been a light in his otherwise colorless youth. Now all he could do was pray he'd hear it again. It was nearly 6 hours before the doors finally swung open, and a doctor in pale green scrubs stepped into the room. Callan rose to his feet instantly, Marlowe jerking awake beside him, startled and wide-eyed. The doctor removed his mask, revealing a tired but relieved expression. "She's out of surgery," he said. "It went well. We were able to remove the tumor successfully. There were complications, some minor bleeding and tissue adhesion, but nothing we couldn't manage. She'll need time to heal, but she's alive." Marlowe burst into tears, her hands clapped over her mouth. Callan exhaled sharply, his shoulders slumping as a weight he hadn't realized he was physically carrying began to fall away. "Can we see her?" he asked. "In a little while," the doctor said. "She's in recovery, still under sedation. Give it another hour." Callan thanked him and sat back down, pulling Marlowe gently into his lap. She didn't protest. She buried her face into his chest and cried in that silent, overwhelmed way only children know, when relief and exhaustion collide so hard they can no longer be separated. When she had calmed down, they waited together quietly. Callan found himself telling her stories, not fairy tales, but small moments from his childhood. How he used to sneak into his father's office to play with the typewriter, how he once tried to build a rocket out of soda bottles and nearly blew up the garage. She laughed, even through her swollen eyes. "You were kind of weird," she said. "Still am," he replied with a smirk. When they were finally allowed into the recovery room, Callan carried Marlowe in his arms. Rowena lay in a hospital bed, tubes running from her arms, a monitor beeping steadily at her side. Her eyes fluttered open slowly, unfocused at first. Then she saw them. "Marlowe," she whispered, her voice hoarse but warm. "I'm here, Mama," Marlowe said, sliding from Callan's arms and taking her mother's hand. Rowena's gaze moved to Callan. Their eyes met, and for a long, suspended moment, they didn't look away. There was no need to explain what had changed. It was already understood. "You stayed," she said, more a statement than a question. "I told you I would." A tear slipped from the corner of her eye. "I'm not used to people keeping their promises." He moved closer, gently brushing her hair from her forehead. "Get used to it." The nurse appeared then to check Rowena's vitals, reminding them that she needed rest. Callan stepped back, letting Marlowe kiss her mother's cheek before they quietly left the room. That evening, Callan returned to the mansion with Marlowe. But something was different now. Something more than the knowledge that Rowena had survived. He sat in the library, his personal sanctuary, with Marlowe curled up on the leather couch, sketching in a notebook. The fireplace crackled, casting a golden hue over the dark wood panels. He stared at the framed photo now sitting on his desk. It was a printout of a scan the nurse had given him, an image from the surgery, showing the tumor, the scar, and the miracle of survival. He had ordered the photo not out of medical interest, but as a reminder of how close he had come to losing what he didn't even know he had, and of how fragile life could be when measured in hours instead of numbers. That night, as Marlowe fell asleep upstairs and the house stood silent, Callan wrote a new will, quietly, without hesitation. He named Marlowe as his heir, not because of obligation, not because of guilt, but because somewhere between the moment she whispered that first request on the plane and the moment she fell asleep with her hand in his, she had become his child. And he knew, deep in the place where wealth and power held no meaning, that she always would be. The morning after the surgery, sunlight poured gently through the grand windows of the east wing, casting a warm glow on the cream-colored walls and the polished wooden floors. Callan sat at the breakfast table, unusually quiet, a newspaper untouched beside his espresso. The house was unusually still. Marlowe was upstairs, still asleep after a long night at the hospital. And for once, there were no urgent phone calls, no international meetings, and no board members to appease. Only the sound of birdsong and the low hum of the estate's staff moving through the halls like whispers. He was different now, and he knew it. Something inside him had shifted. The emptiness that had once been filled with deadlines and acquisitions now throbbed with something unfamiliar, yet deeply human. Care, fear, hope. He walked through the quiet halls and paused at the base of the staircase, looking up. As if sensing him, Marlowe appeared at the top landing in a pair of pajamas far too big for her braids loose, and a sleep-dazed look on her face. "You're up early," he called softly. She nodded, rubbing her eyes. "Couldn't sleep." Callan smiled. I made pancakes. Don't ask how they turned out." Her face lit up with amusement, and she padded down the stairs barefoot, following the scent of something slightly burnt and overly sweet into the dining room. When she saw the pile of imperfect pancakes stacked like a collapsed tower, she giggled. "Wow," she said dramatically. "You tried." "I did," he said with mock seriousness, "and I fully expect applause." Marlowe gave a slow, exaggerated clap as she sat down. They ate together, and for a moment, the scene could have belonged to any ordinary family. A child in pajamas, syrup smeared on her chin, and a man who had forgotten what loneliness felt like. After breakfast, the two of them got ready to return to the hospital. Callan wore a charcoal gray jacket over a crisp white shirt, and Marlowe picked out a yellow sundress, Rowena's favorite color. She insisted on bringing a hand-drawn card and a little origami crane she had folded herself. But as they approached the hospital, Callan noticed something unusual. Cameras, paparazzi, a handful of reporters clustered around the entrance like vultures. He cursed under his breath. The story had leaked. One of the staff, maybe a nurse, maybe a receptionist, had let slip that Callan Tarot, billionaire recluse and corporate giant, had not only paid for a mysterious woman's full medical care, but had been seen cradling a young girl who bore a striking resemblance to him. The headlines had exploded online just hours ago. Who is Callan Tarot's secret love child? Billionaire CEO hides family from public? Why? The girl who broke the Ice King's heart of stone? He tightened his jaw. The media circus had begun. "Marlowe," he said quietly, "stay close to me. No matter what they say, no matter what they ask, you don't answer. Let me speak." She nodded solemnly and gripped his hand tighter. They exited the car. The flashing lights and shouted questions exploded around them like fireworks. "Mr. Tarot, is she your daughter? Who is the mother? Rowena Hale. Are you planning to marry her? Why hide her all these years?" Callan didn't flinch. He walked forward with measured, powerful steps, shielding Marlowe with his body, his hand never releasing hers. The hospital security rushed to part the crowd and escort them inside. Once they were through the automatic glass doors, the noise faded. Callan turned to Marlowe. "You okay?" She nodded, though her eyes were wide. "They're loud." "They are," he said, "and cruel. But they don't matter. Not really." Inside the hospital suite, Rowena sat upright in bed, visibly stronger than the day before, though a tangle of wires and monitors still surrounded her. When she saw them enter, her eyes filled with warmth. But then she caught sight of Callan's expression. "What happened?" "They found out," he said simply. "The media. Us. You." Her face tensed, panic rippling across it. "Oh no. No, I can't do this. I didn't ask for this attention, Callan. I know, and I'll handle it." She looked at him, her voice tight. "You're a public figure. They'll twist everything. They'll tear Marlowe apart." He stepped closer, his voice firm but gentle. "Not if I stand with you. Not if I make it clear who you both are to me." She shook her head. You don't have to do that. We never asked for. I want to, he interrupted. Not because I have to, because I should have done it years ago, and because I'm tired of hiding from the very things that matter. Marlowe stood silently beside the bed, watching them. Then, in a small voice, she asked, Are we in trouble? Rowena reached out and pulled her close. No, baby. We're not. Callan moved to the window, drawing the curtain slightly to one side. Outside, the press still hovered, and for the first time in decades, he didn't feel the need to run from them. He would face them, all of them, because behind him now was a family, real, messy, beautiful, and it was worth everything. He turned back to them, meeting Rowena's eyes. Come home when you're ready. You'll both be safe there. Forever if you want. She blinked. Forever? He nodded. If you'll have me. Rowena's lips trembled. For a moment, she said nothing. Then, quietly, almost like breathing, she said, Yes. Marlowe beamed. Does this mean, like, we're really a family now? Callan smiled and reached out his hand to her again. We always were, Marlowe. We just didn't know it yet. And as the city buzzed outside, spinning headlines and hungry speculation, the three of them sat together in a quiet hospital room, untouched by it all, wrapped in something far stronger than scandal. They had each other, and that was enough. Spring melted into early summer, and with it, the cold spaces in Kalantero's life seemed to thaw one by one. The once silent mansion on the hill was no longer a hollow monument to solitude. It was filled with sound now. Laughter echoed through marble halls. The scent of baking drifted from the kitchen. Lights stayed on in rooms that had been dark for years. The quiet, colorless world Callan had spent decades building was now filled with life. Rowena was home. 2 weeks had passed since the surgery. Her strength returned slowly but steadily, and though the doctors warned of a long recovery, she met each day with a calm resilience that stirred something deep in Callan. He arranged for a full-time nurse to stay in the house, and even converted a reading lounge into a cozy sunroom just for her, filling it with blankets, books, and the flowers she loved but had never been able to afford before. Marlowe, too, was blooming. She enrolled at a private school under Callan's name, and despite her quiet demeanor, she quickly became known for her wit and startling intelligence. She carried herself with the grace of someone who had survived something invisible and unspoken, and though her uniform fit awkwardly and her shoes squeaked in the long marble hallways, she walked through the world as though she had finally found her place in it. One afternoon, Callan arrived home early, something that would have been unthinkable a year ago. He stepped into the foyer to the sound of music drifting through the halls, soft and familiar. Piano. It was coming from the east drawing room, a space he hadn't entered in years. He followed the sound quietly, stopping just before the door. Inside, Rowena sat on the edge of the velvet piano bench, her fingers gliding gently over the keys. She was thinner now, still fragile, her body marked by the shadows of illness, but the strength in her hands, in her posture, in the soft furrow of her brow as she played. It was breathtaking. Next to her, Marlowe sat watching in quiet reverence. Colin didn't interrupt. He leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, listening to the melody, a tune he had played once, long ago, for Rowena in that dusty library back in Brooklyn. He hadn't known she remembered it. He hadn't known how deeply it lived in her. When the final note faded, she turned her head slightly and saw him. You taught me that song, she said. He stepped inside. I didn't think you remembered. I never forgot, she replied, her eyes soft, even when I wanted to. There was a long silence, a warm silence. Marlowe slipped from the bench and stood beside her mother, then looked at Callan. Can I ask something weird? Callan nodded. Of course. Do you think people get second chances, like real ones? Not the kind that go away if you mess up once. He walked over slowly, knelt to her level, and took her hand. I don't think second chances are given, he said. I think we make them. By choosing not to run away again. Marlowe smiled, then wrapped her arms around his neck. He hugged her back, his eyes briefly closing. That evening, Callan hosted a private dinner on the patio. Only the three of them were there, seated beneath string lights and the rustle of early summer wind. The cook had prepared Rowena's favorite, lemon garlic chicken with rosemary potatoes, and there was a small cake with Marlowe's name on it to celebrate her first week of school. As they finished the meal, Rowena looked at Callan across the table, the candlelight reflecting in her eyes. You know what I realized? She asked. What? That all this time I thought I was surviving for Marlowe, but maybe I was also surviving for you. He said nothing, just reached across the table and took her hand. She held it firmly. Later that night, after the dishes had been cleared and the stars were out in full bloom, Callan stood on the balcony of his bedroom, looking out at the horizon. Marlowe stepped beside him, her small frame wrapped in a cardigan. "Are you happy?" she asked. He looked down at her, surprised by the question. "I think I am," he said slowly. "It's new, but yes, I think I'm really happy." She smiled, then leaned against him, her head resting against his side. "I'm glad I asked you to be my dad on that plane," she said sleepily. He swallowed the lump rising in his throat. "So am I, Marlowe." She looked up at him one last time. "Are you still pretending?" He shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "Not anymore." And as the wind danced through the trees and the stars shimmered overhead, Callan realized that the most extraordinary thing he had ever built wasn't a company or an empire. It was this, a second chance, a family, a home. In my view, the ending of this story is not just heartwarming, it's redemptive in the truest sense. Calantero begins as a man shaped by power, wealth, and the emotional walls he's built to survive. But what makes this story so resonant is how one small, desperate request from a little girl, "Could you pretend to be my dad?" becomes the crack that lets the light in. By the final chapter, Callan doesn't just gain a daughter or rekindle a long-lost love, he recovers something far more profound, his humanity. The transformation isn't sudden or overly romanticized. It's quiet, gradual, earned through vulnerability, forgiveness, and the courage to stay when everything in him was conditioned to walk away. Marlowe is the soul of the story. Her innocence carries wisdom beyond her years, and her bravery not only saves her mother, but also revives the heart of a man who didn't realize how alone he truly was. The ending works because it's not a fairy tale. It's a reflection of real emotional possibility. That healing takes time, that broken people can still build something whole, and that sometimes family isn't found in blood or plans. It's found in the miracle of being chosen and choosing back. To me, this story is about the quiet power of second chances, and how love, once truly embraced, changes everything.